the most horrifying execution methods used by ancient monarchs. The chamber was already thick with smoke when they dragged him in. Not the smoke of firewood. This was sweeter, cloying, the scent of fat melting onto hot metal. His bare feet left streaks across the stones, blood and ash smearing into one dark trail. Courtiers pressed closer, silks brushing against each other, their jeweled fingers covering noses, but never their eyes. No one wanted to miss the moment. At the center stood the great bronze bull, polished to a grotesque shine. Its mouth gaped open as if roaring, though the roar would come only when flesh inside began to burn. The king himself lounged on a carved chair, sipping wine the color of arterial blood, the rim of his cup stained where his lips lingered too long. His smile never cracked. He wanted to hear the voice, the transformation of human screams into the music of the bull. The guards shoved the condemned man forward. His body sagged like a rag of bones, yet his eyes searched wildly for mercy in the crowd. None came. A priest muttered low words not of comfort, but of ritual, sprinkling herbs that crackled on the embers. The stench grew worse. The queen tilted her head, pearls swinging at her ears, and whispered to the king. No one heard her words, but they saw the flicker of delight on his face. The prisoner was hoisted, shoved inside the metal belly. The door slammed. Bolts slid into place. Then came the fire. Then came the sound. Not a scream, not human anymore, but a bellow that shook the chamber. Men clapped as though at a performance. Women fanned themselves to hide their trembling lips. And yet, the worst detail was never written in the records. The palace always smelled of roses in the morning, though no rose garden was large enough to drown the other scents that lurked in its corridors. Behind the polished marble, servants scrubbed blood from stone basins, where sacrifices were washed away before dawn. By the time courtiers arrived for the daily procession, the place gleamed, fragrant with petals and incense. It looked perfect. It always had to look perfect. At sunrise, the king walked the gallery where golden bowls of milk were left as offerings to forgotten gods. Courtiers bowed so low their foreheads pressed against cold that wasn't always for food. The queen played her own games. She kept a collection of jewels not in a chest, but in the mouths of her ladies-in-waiting. Each woman held a gem under her tongue during supper. After the meal, the queen inspected them, one by one, her cold fingers brushing their lips. Some said she liked to see which woman trembled most when she reached inside. Others whispered she was measuring loyalty by the taste of fear. Behind these rituals, cracks spread. Prisoners disappeared into the lower vaults, where water never touched daylight. Servants spoke of chambers lined with salt to slow decay, bodies preserved for the king's fascination. Foreign envoys left the palace praising its splendor, but with shaky hands, for they had seen too much at feasts, where the laughter always sounded slightly off, too sharp, too rehearsed. And yet the most dangerous rituals were not public. In the inner sanctum, where only a handful of trusted men entered, punishments were rehearsed like theater. A condemned man might be dressed in silk robes, painted with perfumes, seated at the banquet table as though honored, before being dragged away at the queen's signal. The courtiers kept eating, while, in the distance, muffled cries mixed with the music of lutes. No one spoke of it aloud. They only sipped more wine. They only applauded when the king rose. They only prayed, silently, that they would not be next. Perfection was the mask. The rot was already inside. And yet, the betrayal that would rip the mask away was closer than anyone knew. It began with a secret touch in the tapestry gallery, not the vulgar clutch of a court lout, but a hand that lingered for the length of a heartbeat on a wrist already encircled with gold. The king's favorite, a boy with clever eyes and a mouth made for charming lies, had taken to delivering letters rolled inside falcon anklets. To whom? To the queen, to the king, to both. He believed himself indispensable, and for a season he was. He played them like a harp, each string humming to his fingers. But there are instruments that bite the musician back. He forgot that the walls were the true audience. The first whisper came from the perfumers. They said the queen preferred ambergris rubbed at the base of the throat, because the scent lingered longest when one was kissed. Marble room warmed by braziers. A bronze effigy of a bull stood at the center, polished to a mirror. The inventor had promised, long ago, in another cruel court, that the screams inside would be transformed into music. The king's steward passed around tiny bells on silk cords and asked each guest to choose one. When the favorite entered, wrists bound with ribbon, the courtiers shook their bells as if welcoming him to a dance. He fell to his knees, not from devotion, but calculation. He pressed his forehead to the stone and spoke against it. Mercy fractures best when it hears its own echo. He looked to the queen, whose pearls were the color of old milk. Her mouth did not move, but her hand did, just enough to smooth a crease at her hip. The gesture meant no. The bull was not used that night. The king preferred the ache of suspense. He had a taste for prologue. What came next was learned from old Persia, where honey is both blessing and weapon. In a garden pavilion shaded by plane trees, they brought a condemned nobleman who had plotted to sell the army's winter maps. He was fed milk until he vomited, then honey until he vomited sweetness. They smeared more honey along his limbs and face, binding him into a shallow boat. Another boat laid over him like a lid. Only his eyes, mouth, and hands saw daylight. The servants pushed the scaves into a pond, where reeds sang to insects. Some say the king visited each morning, cup in hand, to watch the work of flies, the slow industry of ants, the patient proboscis of mosquitoes. The nobleman crooned nursery songs on the second day. By the fourth, he pleaded for water, with a tongue that sounded like wet paper. The queen sent a bowl of honey. But here the court learned something more terrifying than cruelty. Time can be a collaborator. Even the most defiant disappear when the reeds decide to keep them. In the eastern hall, lacquered red and black, the king received a gift wrapped in yellow silk, a text from a distant dynasty, describing a punishment the translator rendered blandly as lingering death. Ling Chi. The chapter was thin as a blade. The margins smelled faintly of camphor. The executioner appointed for the demonstration was a man with narrow wrists and a calm breath. He prepared, not with whetstones, but with a festival lantern. The queen liked the symbolism, impurity made into vapor, rising like a prayer. Another time, in a courtyard hung with tapestries wavering like sails, she ordered a traitor suspended by iron hooks, threaded beneath his ribs. Meat should be displayed as meat, she told her ladies. The hooks left no bruises, only bright mouths that refused to close. A bird landed on the man's shoulder and pecked at his hairline. The queen smiled. The ladies took turns, pretending to faint. And yet, the sin that undid them all was not lust or forgery or treachery to the army. It was a letter. The favorite had written it, a draft never sent, and hidden it inside the hollow spine of a devotional book. A scullery boy found it while dusting, and, dazzled by the gleam of the wax seal, he imagined, brought it to a guard, who brought it to a scribe, who brought it to the king's chamberlain, who did not bring it to the king, because he too was named in the letter. The draft accused the queen of using her ladies as taste tasters, not for poison, but for fidelity. She had them kiss the king's goblet before each banquet, so she could see whose breath his lips preferred. The draft sketched the route of a concealed door from the king's rooms to the tapestry gallery, marked with a little drawing of a hand. At the bottom, a postscript. I am done serving 2 masters. Tomorrow, I will serve 3. The chamberlain burned the draft in a lamp and kept the ash in a little porcelain bowl, thinking he had neutralized it. But ash clings. A pinch fell onto his cuff, smearing into the silk. The king's hound, a creature trained to scent resin and wax and many other things, licked his sleeve at a council session. The king glanced once at the wet patch, and the chamberlain's life narrowed to the width of a doorframe. When the trap finally closed, it did so with ceremony. Dawn rites at the palace were usually devoted to bread and blessing, salt scattered, loaves marked with a knife in the shape of a fish. That morning, the king ordered a different rite. In the courtyard facing east, Soldiers erected a stout oaken frame. Ropes hung like quiet serpents. A block and tackle groaned as men tested the weight. The crowd assumed hanging. They were wrong. The king faced symmetry of horses, the balance of pull. The master of stables chose animals with steady temperaments and dark, unblinking eyes. The favorite twisted his head and, for one moment, met the queen's gaze. Her expression was like a shutter closing. But at the last instant, this was his innovation. The king paused the spectacle. He had the favorite hoisted just high enough that his toes brushed the earth, without touching it. Body a pendulum, measuring a time that didn't want to pass. Between pulls, a priest recited psalms. The rhythm was calculated to stretch the audience's nerves to the thinnest strand. "Musician," the king said to the lutenist, "play the same note again and again until it tastes of iron." Foreign envoys watched from a balcony scented with jasmine water. An ambassador from a desert kingdom covered his mouth with a silk handkerchief embroidered with blue tulips. "You will report what you see," whispered his interpreter. He nodded, but he would write about the feast afterward, not this. He wanted to keep his tongue. Elsewhere, beyond the palace, there were other theaters. In a fortress overlooking a river, an impalement was conducted with expertise that passed for compassion. A greased stake, angled to miss the organs that end things too quickly. A cup of water pressed to cracked lips every hour. Not kindness, but prolongation. The executioner hummed a lullaby, perhaps to calm his own hands, while the sky bleached from gold to white. In a southern province, the monarch favored elephants, trained to tread lightly, and then not lightly at all. The switch, a tiny flick of the mahout's wrist. The court loved the duality, mercy and annihilation, both living in a single beast. These were not random entertainments. They were messages, written on bodies instead of parchment. To sleep with the queen, boil the skin that touched her. To forge the seal, carve the crime into flesh, until it was unreadable. To steal from the army, feed the thief to the small soldiers no king can command. The ants, the flies, the fever. And yet, the most devastating betrayal remained. The queen discovered that the king had kept not only the favorite's letters, but a diary, bound in black goatskin, in which the favorite recorded every time. A little table, a single item waiting, a ring made from the favorite's hair, braided with gold. The queen had left it there, as insurance that she would always own the narrative. The king slipped the ring on and felt it scratch like a living thing. He did not take it off. The courtyard smelled of wet rope, even after the servants scrubbed, even after lime was scattered and incense burned. The air clung with something sweet and foul, as though the stones themselves refused to forget. At dawn, pigeons circled but would not land. They knew. Animals always know. The king had ordered the remains of his favorite hidden, but concealment in a palace is always temporary. Servants talk, guards brag. The butcher in the lower ward swore he saw carts rolling before sunrise, weighted down with something that dripped. He pointed to the streaks along the cobbles, darker than wine, and said, "Meat does not leave trails like that unless it wishes to be followed." The rumor spread before the blood dried. The courtiers adapted quickly. They practiced new smiles, this time wider, emptier, careful not to reveal disgust. At supper, when the king raised his goblet, every man and woman followed instantly, though some choked on the heavy, spiced wine. The queen, pale beneath her pearls, let her finger rest too long on the stem of her cup. Her stillness was a performance of its own, a warning that she was not the next victim, but the co-author of the sentence. And yet, there were cracks. A page boy found a shred of silk ribbon near the stables, stiff with dried blood. He tucked it into his boot like a charm, and whispered it to a maid, who whispered it to a guard, who whispered it to a priest. Soon, the ribbon became a relic, proof that the favorite had not been erased, but transformed into legend. Execution became spectacle now, a theater no one could escape. The king ordered public punishments, to remind the city that treachery was contagious, and contagion must be burned. In the marketplace, a thief was lowered into a cauldron of boiling oil until his skin blistered into a grotesque second garment. Vendors kept selling onions and eels as steam rose, pretending the smell was only supper. Mothers told their children, "Eat quickly, or the king will cook you too." The queen staged her own silent. They muttered that the king had turned from ruler to butcher, that the queen's pearls were soaked in men's marrow. Bread grew scarce, wine soured in its casks, yet punishments multiplied. A merchant whispered, "We cannot eat terror," and was found hanged in his own warehouse the next day. His body was left, swaying for 3 nights, the rope creaking a lullaby no one wanted. Inside the palace, priests began to refuse the blessings. One muttered, "The soul flees before the knife touches," and was silenced by a royal guard's fist. Another fled entirely, leaving his vestments draped over the altar like the skin of a snake. Faith itself seemed to be retreating from the marble walls. The king's nights grew restless. He drank more, pacing galleries, staring at the empty tapestries as though waiting for a door to open again. Some swore they saw him whisper to shadows, calling the favorite's name. The queen noticed and began sleeping in a separate chamber, guarded by 4 women with knives beneath their pillows. The final collapse came not with a rebellion, but with silence. One evening, during a feast, a roast peacock was brought out, feathers reattached, eyes painted with gold leaf. No one clapped, no one laughed. The king raised his goblet, and the hall remained still. Only the queen lifted hers, lips brushing the rim, pearls trembling at her ears. The silence was not defiance, not loyalty. It was emptiness, a court hollowed by too much blood. And yet, even then, no one spoke the favorite's name aloud. His ghost was stronger than memory. His absence filled every corridor, every banquet, every breath. He was still there, dangling just above the floor, toes brushing eternity. Years passed, but the stain would not lift. Rain washed the courtyard 100 times, yet the stones still gleamed darker where the ropes had swung. Even when new banners were hung, even when children were born within those walls, every servant knew which corner to avoid when dusk fell. The pigeons never returned. The king aged, though he pretended otherwise. He still demanded morning rituals with bowls of milk and incense, still staged feasts where laughter was forced to sound like bells. But at night, when his guards shifted in the corridor, they heard him speaking. Not prayers, not orders, just a name, whispered again and again, preserved like a relic. Others whispered that his body was ground to powder, mixed with saffron, and served at a banquet where the courtiers smiled with stained teeth. A Venetian letter hinted at a ring braided with human hair, worn until it cut the king's skin raw. No one knew if the ring was ever buried with him, or if it still circled a royal finger somewhere, scratching. The unanswered question lingered heavier than any execution. Was the favorite destroyed, or was he immortalized through cruelty, bound to the court's rituals forever? The silence around his name was its own kind of eternity. And so the palace remained, polished marble, roses in the air, silk brushing silk, and beneath it, a secret hum, like the echo of a scream that never finished.